A story from the book of Genesis. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great, that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made humankind, and it grieved him to his heart. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did all that God commanded him. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah with his sons Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons entered the ark. They and every wild animal of every kind, and all domestic animals of every kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every bird of every kind. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, and everything on dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. But God remembered Noah, and all the wild animals, and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made, and sent out the raven, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent out the dove to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him to the ark. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove, and the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him. God said to Noah, Go out of the ark, and you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. And then God said to Noah, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, with every living creature that is with you. I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature. Let's please join.
Almost every culture on earth has an ancient flood story. In fact, anthropologists have collected over 250 of these stories. And though the characters and the setting and the theological reason for the flood change, the plot is the same. There is a big flood, and only a few survive. Older than even the Genesis story is the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, which is about a king who embarks on a journey to find the secret for immortality. Along the way, he meets someone who has survived the great flood sent by the gods, and he hears his story. And the survivor says that he was warned by Enki, the water god. And so he had the chance to build a boat, and he saved his family and friends, along with artisans, animals, and precious metals. Ancient Greeks and Romans grew up with the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who saved their children and a collection of animals by building a vessel shaped like a giant box. Irish legends talk about Queen Cessair and her court, who sailed for 7 years to avoid drowning when the oceans overwhelmed Ireland. Columbia University geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman wondered what could explain the preponderance of flood legends. Their theory? During the Ice Age, the Black Sea was an isolated freshwater lake surrounded by farmland. About 12,000 years ago, Earth began growing warmer. The vast sheets of ice that sprawled over the northern hemisphere began to melt. The oceans and the seas grew deeper. About 7,000 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea swelled and the seawater pushed northward, going through what is now Turkey. And funneling through a narrow strait, the water hit the Black Sea with 200 times the force of Niagara Falls. Each day, the Black Sea grew about 6 inches, and coastal farms were flooded. Seared into the memories of terrified survivors, the tale of the flood was passed down through the generations and eventually became the Great Flood story in one form or another. No matter what the event was that spawned these epic flood stories, the fact is, at some point in history, there was a flood that killed a lot of people and animals, and it scared to death those who survived. It's human nature to ask the question, why? And it is the nature of religion to create an answer. In the ancient culture in which the people believed that everything came about because of some action or inaction of the gods, we can understand why the 2 accounts of the flood in Genesis 6 through 9 attribute the cause or agency of the flood to God. And yes, there are 2 accounts. Because of literary and linguistic characteristics, scholars reveal for us that Genesis 6 through 9 is read as one story, as John just read for us, but it is in fact 2 different accounts from 2 different writers. One writer, who uses the personal name of Yahweh, the Lord, for the deity, reasons that the Lord caused the flood because the wickedness of humankind was great, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was evil continually. The other writer, who more generally refers to the deity by the name Elohim, or God, reasons that God determined to make an end of all flesh of the earth because it's filled with violence because of them. Who is the them in this story for which we can blame such destruction? Seems like we've always been pointing fingers and blaming from the beginning. Do you remember Adam and Eve just a few weeks ago? Well, some believe that the them refers to the Nephilim mentioned right before the flood story begins in the scriptures, in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim are believed to be the offspring that came about by the mating of the sons of God, which are divine beings of the heavenly court, and the daughters of Adam. And their name, Nephilim, in Hebrew literally means fallen ones. However, New Testament scholar Ellen White says it's unlikely that this interpretation is correct because Genesis 6:4 presents nothing but praise for the Nephilim. There's no criticism present. And the name fallen ones is likely a reference to their divinity or their divine paternity transforming or falling, right, down into human status. Other scholars think the them of which God speaks is everyone. Because the moment that Cain killed Abel, and the Lord said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground. And when you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Well, scholar Matthew Lynch makes the point that this curse from God stops creation's normal functions across the earth. Because if the land doesn't yield its strength, then it is not providing adequate food for the people. And if the land does not provide adequate food for the people, then the people are always moving and they have no stable home. They have to wander. They have to be fugitives in search of food. And so, because there's no resolution to this dilemma that's caused by the curse on the land, and because there's no system yet for handling human-to-human violence, creation collapses. In other words, when people are hungry and resources are scarce, violence abounds. And when there is no system of accountability or justice yet in place, violence abounds. And when people have no safe place to call home, violence abounds. No matter who the them is that we are wont to blame in this story, the biblical memory of this flood and the memory of all ancient cultures is that the whole world as they knew it was wiped out. We can imagine that the people of the day were traumatized as they experienced this great flood, as they watched their loved ones drown and everything they owned go underwater. Did you know we have people in our congregation who survived the physical devastation from Hurricane Katrina, but who are still recovering from all the emotional devastation of it? We can imagine that Noah and his family, or the survivors from other great flood narratives, well, we can imagine that they have their own emotional and spiritual trauma to overcome. And the few that survived, they began to tell this story to their children, and their children told it to their children. And perhaps because of how horrifying it was, they told the story not just in terms of the facts of this natural disaster, but in terms of why this natural disaster happened. For perhaps it could serve as a warning not to be violent or evil or corrupt again. Because if you're good, who knows? God might spare you, like he did Noah. But if you're not, God could wipe out the world in a matter of 40 days. Using fear as a means of getting people to believe in God and to behave well is not a new thing to religion. Yet, you and I have taken the fear out of this story, haven't we? We sing about Noah to our children. We focus on how wonderful it is that God saved Noah and the animals, and how they marched by twosies onto the arky made of barky. And when all was said and done, everything was hunky-dory. Go home this afternoon and listen to that song on YouTube again. It is amazing. The details that we omit and change. Why do we not tell our children the violent and scary part of this story? Do we not want them to know either this part of God or this part of humanity? Of course we don't, right? We don't want to believe it's real. But is that wise? I don't know how it was back then, but I know that now, today, we are numb to our violence. The violence that we propagate with our words and our silences, with our actions and our inactions. We want to pretend it doesn't exist, so we turn off the news and we cover our children's ears, and we ask our teachers not to discuss it in the classroom, and our preachers not to mention it from the pulpit. We want to pretend that our world is not violent, just like how we want to pretend that the Noah and the Ark story is gentle enough to be turned into wallpaper for a baby's nursery. Now, this week, I couldn't help but focus in Genesis on how God was grieved at the violence God saw happening in God's creation. And I wondered about just how grieved God was on Thursday when yet another mass shooting occurred. And I wondered if God was just not grieved at the actions of one man, but I wonder where God's emotions are as we talk about mental health issues in our country and gun control laws and how protected privileges and public policy intersect or don't intersect. In America, there is a mass shooting, which is defined as 4 or more people shot in one incident, nearly every day. In fact, there have been 994 mass shootings in the last 1,004 days, killing over 1,200 people and injuring over 3,600. And if those statistics aren't sobering enough, here are the ones that are even more shocking to me. From 2001 to 2013, more than 406,000 people died by firearms on U.S. soil. Now, this data includes all manners of death: homicide, accident, suicide. According to the U.S. State Department, the number of U.S. citizens killed overseas or here in the United States as a result of incidents of terrorism in that same period was 3,400. Even though the number of deaths from foreign terrorists is significant and tragic, it is less than 1% of the number of deaths from our own citizens on our own soil. We will do anything to stop terrorism that people from other nations inflict upon us, but we can't seem to do anything to stop the violence we inflict upon ourselves in our own country. I cannot make sense of this, and it seems that none of us can, right? Because we can't seem to come together and figure out what we can do to halt or at least decrease such violence. Everyone has their simple answers to this very complex problem. But at some point, I'm thinking that maybe we should try some of these simple answers, because maybe that's better than trying nothing at all. I've been wrestling all week with this question of why, when it comes to violence in our own country, but also trying to understand Noah's story and trying to find hope in it. And I found new insight here. By reading this story, not primarily as Noah's story, but as primarily God's story. The moral of the story today is that not only is Noah one lucky and faith-filled guy, God is one empathic and faithful God. Why do I say this? Because it seems that the story is just as devastating for God as it is the rest of the world. Here again, Genesis 6:6. The Lord was sorry that he had made humankind, and it grieved him in his heart. The way the Genesis tale goes, all that God had created, all that God had poured life and breath into, God decided to destroy. And surely that decision was not made light. God did not create the world and name each part of the world good, only to have the very ones that God created take all that was good in the world and make it bad. To watch that happen is like a parent watching their child make poor decision after poor decision. Decisions that harm their health and their future. Decisions that stunt their progress rather than maximize their potential. The way the story is told, it's almost as if God wishes God could just wipe it all out and start over again. He kind of does. This reminds me of helping my 2-year-old nephew, William, build roads and buildings out of blocks. We worked so hard to get all the blocks to fit together in the right place and to balance one on top of the other. And then without warning, bam, William knocks it all down, and he wants to start all over again. It's a fun game for him. But it can be a metaphor for what we wish we could do with our own lives sometimes, right? Knock it all down and start over again. But it's never that easy. I'm not sure that this is exactly how God was feeling in the Genesis story, but it seems close to it. And this is what makes the Genesis flood story so different from all the rest. God has deep feelings, and God acts on those feelings. This is not an act from a vengeful heart, it's an act from a broken heart. The God of the book of Genesis is not a remote deity like Zeus, who wantonly destroys those who displease him. No, our God is intimately involved with God's creation. And ultimately, even though God vows to destroy the world, God will not abandon it entirely. A hero for their story, one that they can aspire to be like. Noah, the one who walks with God, the one whom God spares along with his family. They too can be faithful. Old Testament and Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann says that we're confronted in this text actually not with a flood, but with a heavy, painful crisis in the dealings of God with creation. The crisis is not the flood water. That just becomes the dramatic setting where this takes place. The crisis becomes of the resistant character of the world, which evokes hurt and grief in the heart of God. The narrative, he says, is centered in the grief of God, whose heart knows about our hearts. When you read the text, it affirms that God is decisively impacted by the suffering, hurt, and circumstances of creation. And yet, the flood does not affect any change in humankind, does it? We continue to sin. But it does affect an irreversible change in God, who now approaches creation with unlimited patience and grace. Brueggemann says that God has been committed to creation from the beginning. But what happens in this story is that God, once perhaps with proclivities for vengeance, is now a God who grieves and who continually offers grace in the face of our continual sin. Again, how we act as humans really doesn't change. Keep reading the story, and Noah, he's not so faithful anymore right after this story is over. But God's changes. As the story is passed down in our faith tradition, it was passed down not as a tragic one, but as a story of hope and new beginnings and grace. The rainbow, which is why I'm wearing this stole today, is the physical sign and symbol for this hope, for this theological promise from God. God is a God of hope, of promise, of new beginnings. No matter how much destruction happens to us or how much destruction we bring upon ourselves. Now, this doesn't let us off the hook. It actually means we have a bigger task before us. Because when we realize the depths of God's love and grace for us, we also realize the depth of God's love and grace for everyone else, too. And we're convicted to be part of the solution, not the problem. I wonder, in the midst of all the violence in our country and world right now, if there are rainbows all over the place that we're just not looking up to see. Or maybe we're creating too many clouds to see them. We're covering up God's hope with our desperation and destruction and despair. Perhaps the rainbows are there. We need the eyes to see them and the hearts to believe in them. Or maybe they're not there. But then that means we perhaps are to place them there ourselves. Because if a rainbow symbolizes hope and new life and grace, then anything we do to end violence and death and to spread hope and grace is, metaphorically speaking, a rainbow. You know, there's so much more to this story than we read today. But you see throughout Hebrew Scriptures that God's promise is not one-sided, right? It is a covenant. It is a give and take between God and God's people, and vice versa. Author and poet Maya Angelou said, God put the rainbow in the clouds, not just the sky. It is wise to realize we already have rainbows in our clouds, or we wouldn't be here. If the rainbow is in the clouds, then in the worst of time, there is the possibility of seeing hope. We can say, I can be a rainbow in the cloud for someone else. That may be our calling, she said. I think it is. To see the rainbow in Noah's story, or God's story. To see the rainbows in our own stories and to create them for the stories of people who currently can't see them. Just think of the stories that you're sharing through your life right now. Are they stories, narratives of doom and gloom and destructive floods? Or are they stories where at least the faintest colors of a rainbow can be seen? Horrible things happen in our lives, in our country. Things that are unfair. But they're not just unfair to us. They are unfair to all. Because as the Apostle Paul reminds us, when one part of our body is hurt, the whole body hurts. Injustice for one is injustice for all. We have the power to change that story, that narrative, so that what we experience in the future will not be the same. I don't know about you, but I don't want to keep living in the story of violence in our country. And I'm sure you don't want to keep living in the story of any kind of pain or guilt or sorrow in your own life. Know that there is hope. The end of the Noah story is all about that hope, about God's faithfulness. It's the heart of the Christian story, too. Another American author and poet, which is quoted in your bulletin, Nabrajani, says, rainbows introduce us to reflections of different beautiful possibilities. So we never forget that pain and grief are not the final options in life. Christ gave us the final and lasting option for our lives, resurrection. Life is stronger than death. Hope is greater than despair. Forgiveness trumps guilt. Grace leaves no room for grudges. Healing can displace violence. And peace for all can propagate in the midst of our pride that wants so badly to protect our personal privileges. Life, hope, forgiveness, grace, healing, peace. These are options for us. Options that create rainbows and point to clear skies and dry land, rather than options that hold us under storm clouds or keep us rocking on stormy waters. Just like our Hebrew ancestors, we get to choose how we tell our story. Do we focus on the destruction and the violence, or do we allow the rainbow be the lasting image of God's grace and action in our lives? Amen.